Hi, and welcome to Psychology 1, and we're now going to look at memory. Our memory is very intriguing, isn't it? It could be so frustrating at times when our memory doesn't seem to serve us very well. Like forgetting the phone number of someone you would like to really go out with, or sometimes, even more frustrating is when you have studied for an exam and can't recall important information on the exam. On the other hand, we feel great when our memory does serve us well, such as remembering how to get somewhere you haven't been in a long time, like your friend's summer cottage or out to a out-of-town friend's house. In this video, part 1, we're going to explore our memory process, the nature of remembering and factors that influence our retrieval of information. So let's get started with the process of memory. Psychologists and computer scientists speak of processing information. When we perceive information, we must convert it into a form that can be remembered. Memory is a process by which information is encoded, stored, and retrieved. Let's look at those individually. Encoding. Encoding is about information that's about the outside world and our senses in the form of some sort of physical and chemical stimuli. So when we encode information, we transform it into a psychological format that can be represented mentally. We must pay attention to the material for it to be encoded. So anything we spend time on, anything that we are focused on is what we can be encoding, putting it into our memory. Now, there are a few different, shall we say, coding methods. There's the visual code, remembering things as a picture, and then there's the acoustic code, or remembering things as a sequence of sounds. There's also what we would call a semantic code, and this is remembering things in terms of their meaning. Now, storage, this is the memory's save function, if you will. Storage is about maintaining information over time, and there are some physiological changes in the brain to support memory, and this is known as consolidation. Now, one method by which to consolidate information is through maintenance rehearsal, the mentally repeating of information that you might go over and over to hold onto that information and store it. Now, there's a term that's known as meta-memory. And that's our awareness of the functioning of our memory. So it's our self-awareness of our own memory capabilities. Now, I mentioned about maintenance rehearsal. There is also what's known as elaborative rehearsal, or elaborating on or extending the semantic meaning of what you're trying to remember. Now, the second stage is known as retrieval. So this is the memory's find function. Retrieval of stored information requires locating it and returning it to consciousness. And that doesn't always work, and therein lies where we have some of our difficulties. So how do we measure memory? Well, there's three basic categories or tasks, three basic memory tasks that have been used to measure forgetting: recognition, recall, and relearning. Again, we're going to look at those. Recognition, the failure to recognize something we have experienced. The easiest type of memory task or information must simply be recognized as having been encountered. That's the first component. So, like when you study for a test and you read the question and you answer it, you are recognizing things that you've studied. If you don't study, you do very little studying, or you do very little studying, there's limited or no recognition. So, for example, B.F. Skinner was the founder of operant conditioning, true or false. To use retrieval cues gives you a hint that the information that is required. For example, the founder of operant conditioning theory was B.F. and a line, you might remember or retrieve Skinner. because you knew BF and operant conditioning were the cues to remind you that Skinner was the founder of operant conditioning. Now, recall is remembering information from memories without cues. Remembering cold, no prompts. Now, research conducted in this area used what was called paired associates. Now, in your textbook, and you'll see in figure 6.1, an example of this. Now, there's a list of paired words. Subjects are recall tasks and have to remember the paired words. Recall is much more difficult than recognition. Then the third one, relearning. Relearning is easier than the second time around. We can relearn information much more rapidly the second time. Therefore, it's about measuring retention in terms of time saved in relearning material compared with the time required to learn it originally. Ebbinghaus devised a method of measuring these savings. Record the number of repetitions needed to learn, then record the number of repetitions to relearn the list. Compute the difference, and that's called the savings. Now, we can look at memory in terms of stages of memory and the types of memory. And there's an early model that sort of linked the comparison between memory and a computer, and it was called the Atkinson-Schriffen model of memory. And there are 3 stages of memory. Information progressing through these stages determines how and how long the information will be retained. These stages include sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. Now, you've probably heard of at least 2 of them, the short-term and long-term memory. Atkinson-Schriffen related the model of memory to a computer analogy. Now, sensory memory, these are flashes on the mental monitor. That sensory memory is the type of memory that is first encountered by a stimulus. It allows us to survey for important information long enough to draw our attention and held long enough that a series of perceptions seem to be connected. Now, even though when we look around, everything looks smooth and uninterrupted, however, what is known as the saccadic eye movements occurs 4 times every second. Now, what I would ask you to do, and try this sometime, is if you watch someone's eyes when they scan the environment, you might think because your experience makes it appear smooth. But if you watch somebody or record yourself with your cell phone camera and record, you'll see your eyes jitter across, skip across. In a way, our eyes are taking pictures about 4 every second, and our brain fills in the gaps and makes it appear smooth. So our brain does an awful lot in regards to our getting information and how we remember it and use it. So sensory information is that first stage. Now, for example, memory trace, the visual impression left by the stimuli. It's held in the visual sensory register, that is. Memory trace for visual stimuli decays within seconds. So that really means that the sensory, we get tons of information in the sensory memory, but it doesn't stay there very long unless it's critical or important to what's going on immediately. McDougall and George Sperling had used the whole report procedure and the partial report procedure in the visual memory tasks. This research was looking at the extent of sensory memory and how to better hold sensory content. Now, iconic memory, this is where visual stimuli are referred to as little icons or icons. Like on your phone, there are little icons there. The sensory register that holds icons is labeled as iconic memory. Iconic memories are accurate photographic memories, but briefly stored. Really briefly, by the way. Photographic memory that you may have heard is technically referred as eidetic memory, where the information can be held much longer as a visual content. Eidetic memory imagery, also known as I just mentioned, photographic memory, they have the ability to store visual stimuli for remarkably long periods of time. It's this saccadic eye movement that occurs about 4 times every second that the iconic memory holds icons up to about a second. So like I said, the sensory memory doesn't hold for very long. It can't. There's too much stimulation, too much stimuli, and we only need some of it to navigate the world. And it's this combination that allows us to perceive imagery in a film as being seamless, so you don't see all this jumping about. There's another form of early memory, and it's known as ecolic memory. The mental representations of sounds or auditory are called echoes. The sensory register that holds echoes is called the echoic memory. Sorry about that. Echoic memory can last over several seconds. Now that's sound lasts a little longer than visual, which is interesting, by selectively attending to certain stimuli. So that means we are choosing some to pay attention to and deleting a lot of other stuff. So by selecting and attending to certain stimuli, we sort them out from the background noise. So that's the first part of sensory memory, is to get to what's most important. Now, short-term memory, which is the second stage, if you focus on the stimulus in the sensory register, you will tend to retain in short memory, also known as the working memory. It has the capacity of about 7 bits of information, give or take 2 bits, therefore between 5 and 9 bits, less than 30 seconds. The short-term memory isn't lasting much, a whole lot longer than sensory memory, 30 seconds. So the image tends to be significantly faded after 10 to 12 seconds if not rehearsed. If additional information enters the short-term memory, displacement occurs, and the information that's previously stored in the short-term memory is lost. So this is what's so important about short-term memory and some of these rehearsal strategies, is to keep it active and then be able to transfer it into what's known as our long-term memory. So each new incoming item pushes out existing items, which is then forgotten. To retain the information, rehearsal is needed. Now there's a couple of things to bear in mind, and you've probably had experience. If you have children, you will know this. And if you remember your own childhood, you might remember this as well. And it's what's known as serial position effect. Serial position effect is the tendency that when a person is recalling a list of items to remember, the item at the beginning of the list, that's primacy effect, and the items at the end, recency effect, are better remembered than the middle group. You'll find more detail in your textbook on that to help you out with that. But chances are, if your mom gave you a list of things to do and you only remembered the first 2 things but forgot the remaining 3, or you remember the last 2 things and forgot the beginning 3, that's the recency and primacy effect. Now, one way to improve in the short term is what's called short-term memory rehearsing, is also a title or an item that's called chunking. This is where we group or organize bits of information into larger units. It reduces information to a number of pieces that the short term can manage. For example, the grouping of a word like OHIP. OHIP, O-H-I-P, is the Ontario Health... I just lost it. Ontario Health Initiative Plan, I believe. Your driver's license numbers, you might chunk that into 3 chunks in order to remember it. Researcher Miller found that we can comfortably store 7 chunks plus or minus 1 or 2. This is a magic number of the amount of information that typically a person can remember. We can increase the amount of information by combining into meaningful bits or chunks. Now that's part of how you would do your studying, is to break things into smaller bits and then start to build these chunks, and you can remember that a lot better and store it into long-term memory. Now there are interference issues in short-term memory. Should we be prevented or choose not to include rehearsal? That can inhibit our short-term memory. The appearance of new information can displace old information. Now, the long-term memory, this is your memory's hard drive. Long-term memory is the third stage of the information processing. Freud and some of the others felt that information could be kept in long-term memory permanently. Think of your long-term memory as a vast storehouse of information, the general and the specific, containing names, dates, places, past experiences, knowledge you have acquired. We might not be able to retrieve specific memories, though. So how much information can be stored in long-term memory? Well, for all practical purposes, long-term memory is unlimited. Your long-term memory is a biochemical hard drive with no known limits. The information can endure for a lifetime, and information can be lost but not destroyed or deleted. Remember, I've forgotten which journal it is, but I have put a video in it about Ken Peeks, the Rain Man, if you remember the movie Rain Man. And he remembers everything that he's ever been exposed to in terms of reading, and he reads voraciously. But he remembers everything, never forgets anything. So if his capacity to be in his, I think he was in his late 50s when he died, and he has been reading since he was like 3 or 4 years old, everything that he read, he remembered. That's including phone books. So all the streets, postal codes of everyone in the world. He had a capacity to remember in long term. That's what they mean by long term and lots of memory. Not we haven't got that much use of space because we delete stuff too easily. Now there are two systems in long-term memory. There's the explicit or declarative and implicit non-declarative memory. Let's look at those. Explicit memory or declarative memory, these are memories for specific information. These could be considered your autobiographical or your general knowledge. Now there are two kinds of explicit memory, episodic and semantic. The episodic memory is a form of explicit memory where memories of the things that happen to us or take place in our presence. It's also referred to the autobiographical memory, where you might say, I remember when, and you go on to remember. It's about you and your autobiography of your life. Now, semantic memory, these memories are of general knowledge. Semantic concerns itself with what you know. You know how to make spaghetti, you know how to cook a cake, you know how to build a cabinet. That's your semantic information. Now, implicit memory, this is your non-declarative memory, memory of how to perform tasks, how to do something, like ride a bike. You maybe haven't ridden a bike since you were younger, and you grab a bike and you go on it. You've probably remembered the basics and can do it. That's your implicit memory. Remembering as doing. Implicit memories are suggested, in other words, are implied but not declared. Implicit memories are illustrated by things that people do, but not by the things they state. It can involve skills, both cognitive and physical. They reveal habits and involve effects of conditioning, things that we have learned. Implicit memories can persist even when we're not using them for many years, and can become relatively automatic, referred to as priming. Now, there is what's known as a retrospective memory versus prospective memory. Now, let's look at these and we'll define them. Retrospective memory is the recalling of information that has been previously learned. Episodic, semantic, and implicit memory are recalling things we've learned already. Prospective memory involves remembering to do things in the future, like paying bills. Now, prospective memory tends to fail when we are preoccupied, distracted, feeling stress and pressure at the time. Those things will interfere with our ability to take in and remember new information. Now, there are various types of prospective memory. And these tasks include the habitual tasks, getting to class and other such routine tasks, time-based tasks, tuning into a favorite television program, and a one-time only meeting would be an example. As you expect, there are age-related declines in both retrospective and prospective memory. Maybe due to the processing speed rather than the loss of information in older people. Moods and attitudes have an effect on prospective memory. Negative emotional states impair prospective memory. So, how accurate is our memory from long-term? So how accurate are long-term memory? Well, researcher Elizabeth Loftus notes that memories are distorted by our biases and our needs. We represent our world in a form of schemas or our mental representations of the world. The way we view the world is not the same for everybody. Schemas are the integrated frameworks of knowledge and the assumptions that we have about people, objects, and events. Schemas affect how we encode and recall information. They assist us in processing and understanding vast amounts of stimuli, and because these schemas are developed over a lifetime, they're still unique to each of us. Our life experiences, our family, geography, where we were born, how we were raised. When we receive new information, we tend to try to fit it into things that we already know. And in doing so, we may distort or forget some information. Thus, we have somewhat inaccurate memories. Now, memory reconstruction, can we? This is about the inaccuracy of some memories. Reconstruction relates to the influences of logic, reasoning, and the adding or leaving out of information. This is also related to our schemas, the mental representations that we make to simplify our understandings of memories. So the levels of processing information, well, people use elaborative rehearsals to remember things that are processing information at a deeper level than people who use maintenance rehearsal. Information is remembered if processed deeply. Attend to it, encode it carefully, ponder it, and relate to things that we already know. This is essentially studying. Remembering relies on how deeply we process information. Research has shown that deep processing is related to activity in the prefrontal and the cerebral cortex. So let's look at organizing in how we organize in our long-term memory. People tend to organize information according to a hierarchical structure. A hierarchy is an arrangement of items into groups or classes according to a common or distinct features. As we work our way up the hierarchy, we find more encompassing or subordinate classes to which the items below them belong. For example, all mammals are animals, but they are many types of animals other than mammals. A flashbulb memory is an extremely vivid memory of the conditions surrounding one's first hearing of the news of a surprising or shocking or highly emotional event. For example, when you heard of, if you were old enough to be aware, I guess at that time, watched the World Trade Centers when they were attacked for 9/11, or the news of the Montreal Massacre in 1989, or other emotional events, people tend to remember events that are surprising, important, and emotionally stirring. One factor is the distinctness of memory. The feelings caused by them are special. We are likely to dwell on them and form networks of associations and likely to rehearse them elaborately. Now, if you think in terms of two other ways in which we remember conditions, we have context-dependent memory, where we're more likely to remember information if we are in the same location or environmental context when the information was originally encoded. Context-dependent memories are clear in the context in which they were formed. Being in the proper context can dramatically enhance recall. Context for memory extends to language. The language in which a question is asked may facilitate memories from when that language was last spoken. I can remember giving a test to a woman where she used to study in her little study area, and she had these trolls lined up on her desk and had juju beads and jelly beans, I think it was, in 2 little cups. But she didn't seem to do so well in test, and I asked her about where does she study, and she explained it to me. It was a nice relaxing place. It had these, trolls and little nibblies, and I said, look, bring them to class and put them on your desk and see how that managed. And that was a state-dependent. She studied with these, and so she wrote the test with these, and that made a difference. That's state-dependent. Now, state-dependent memory, that was context-dependent. The second type is state-dependent memory, and this is an extension of context-dependent memory where we retrieve information better when we're in the same physiological or emotional state. That is similar to the one in which we encoded and stored the information. Now, there is evidence of support for this with love, anger, frustration, different levels of inebriation and sobriety. That if I studied when I was angry, I ought to be angry when I write the test. I might do better because that's state-dependent memory. Maybe, I was in my studying, I was relaxed, I was having a nice cup of coffee, had good music on and studying, and so when I go to my class, my level of anxiety went up, and now I don't find that so easy to do. So when we look at memory, it's much more complicated, I suspect, than you thought. This is going to be the end of our part 1 on memory. Now we're going to look at forgetting, the biology of memory, and some tips on improving memory in part 2 next week. So good luck, and I hope you remember to come back next week to see part 2. Bye now.